Is Super Mario RPG the first pebble in the avalanche, the first ripple on the shore before the tsunami? Are we about to see the floodgates open for Super NES remakes? The Super NES has been harvested for remakes previously. Most notably, the Game Boy Advance went to absolute town, porting almost everything Super that moved during its short life. Since then, though, the remake lens has moved elsewhere. Aside from any number of Wii U ports that have come to the Switch, we've had in recent years Pikmin 1 and 2, Metroid Prime, and Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door from GameCube, Kirby Return to Dreamland and Xenoblade Chronicles from the Wii, and Luigi's Mansion 2 and Miitopia from the 3DS. Then there's Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, and Zelda Link's Awakening from Game Boy, and Advance Wars from the Game Boy Advance, plus Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Even the N64 has got in on the action, with lots of the N64 Mario Party courses being reinvented for 2021's Mario Party Superstars, and of course, who can forget the Famicom Detective Club titles being remade gloriously based off the Famicom classics of decades ago. And it's not that the Super NES has been left on the shelf. As I say, Super Mario RPG has come to the platform, and while it's not exactly a remake, F-Zero 99 uses the Super NES F-Zero mechanics in quite an interesting way as its jumping off point. After years of being treated as sacrosanct, the lens of potential remakes is starting to tilt SNESward. While we're talking about a console that is absolutely bursting at the seams with indelible classics, it makes me wonder though, are we about to see a much bigger emphasis on remakes from the 16-bit era of gaming? With gaming development times trending ever upwards, remakes and remasters will continue to be part of the gaming landscape. And while on Nintendo Switch, Nintendo had the benefit of a ready-made bevy of underappreciated beauties in the Wii U library, which it could raid as it will to support the Switch during its early years, the next system will have no such luck. There are still a good number of GameCube and Wii titles available, and now that its lifespan is firmly in the rearview mirror, 3DS titles even, which could make the jump. And it makes sense for this to happen because those systems have yet to appear on the Nintendo Switch Online service, and I certainly think in the short term games like Metroid Prime 2 and 3, Punch-Out!, the Super Mario Galaxy duology, and others will be ripe fruit for the picking, and the company will also want to diversify its choice of remakes. The NES games are generally a little too simplistic, but they've even raided these to some degree, as we see in the case of Nintendo World Championships. So firstly, let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, the Super NES titles are already available to Nintendo Switch Online subscribers. I always thought in the past this would preclude Nintendo from developing these titles during the Switch era and even for the foreseeable future. However, now that the NSO library is substantial enough that it could include multiple different consoles, I don't think it's impossible to imagine that they could remove the odd game here and there to re-release as new after a while. Would there be howls of anguish? Well, maybe, but Nintendo have written these kinds of things out before. Remember the outcry of the limited edition nature of the Super Mario 3D All-Stars title. But more practically, they could probably just put their faith in people buying the new version anyway, especially if the games were sufficiently reworked that the new version felt substantially different from the original. What games are we talking about then? First, and perhaps most strikingly, is Super Metroid. Even a few years ago, I felt like a Super Metroid remake was a Rubicon the fanbase would not allow to be crossed, so sacred was that experience. But after the fluidity and stylishness of Metroid Dread, the consensus appears to have shifted, and I've seen many more people saying they would accept and even look forward to a Super Metroid remake. I talked in a recent video about the potential for the next Yoshio Sakamoto team-up with Mercury Steam to either be a Metroid 6 or a 2.5D Metroid that tries to do justice to what Other M attempted back in 2010, but the possibility pointed out in the comments is that they could finish out the Switch era with Super Metroid before pivoting to a new Metroid iteration in the middle of the next console's life. If Metroid Dread's development time was about 4 years, and since Super Metroid would presumably take a little less time to develop and allow Mercury Steam to continue developing their own original titles, it seems plausible that we could see a Super Metroid remake. I think with a more fluid control system and brilliant atmosphere of Dread, but still keeping the impeccable level design and giving an orchestral polish to the wonderful music, Super Metroid has the potential to really wow people. Then there's Fire Emblem 4. In a previous video, an informed commenter suggested that the SNES Fire Emblem was just too complicated and unlike modern Fire Emblems to be something Nintendo would want to resuscitate. But on the other hand, the often reliable Nate the Hate has doubled down multiple times on its existence, and it has to remain at least a possibility, if only because the top-down gameplay would be relatively easy to remake. And then of course we get The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Alongside Ocarina of Time, it's considered an absolutely iconic Zelda experience, but the game simply does feel dated nowadays. With A Link Between Worlds also out there, I could see a world where Nintendo puts out a dual release. Generally, I'm very skeptical of people predicting these sorts of dual releases. Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp being a glorious exception, it's incredibly rare for Nintendo to sell 2 games in one. They've released anniversary packs such as Super Mario 3D All-Stars, but only then for a limited time and in the barest bones, most begrudging form, while other doubles tend to be dual releases to start with. Famicom Detective Club, Pikmin 1 and 2, and Bayonetta 1 and 2 being examples where it is advantageous to buy both together, but by no means essential. Especially with Zelda, one of, if not the, highest ticket franchises in their library, offering 2 megaton games for only one price seems difficult to fathom, unless of course A Link to the Past was really only given a fairly rudimentary touch-up, which would seem tricky since it would need so much remaking. Then again, a full fat remake of A Link to the Past, with cinematic cutscenes and cameras veering in and out of the 2D, would be a much higher risk proposition, but there's no doubt with such a solid game at its heart, the new version, if it was even basically competent, would become a new beloved classic for the ages. Another series I can see returning in multi-pack form is Donkey Kong Country. Frankly, given the lack of any banana hoarding action since 2018's Tropical Freeze, I'm astonished that they've missed the boat on Switch. A Donkey Kong trilogy title around now would not just be a great game, but would also be an absolutely beautiful realization of the ambition of the original title. After all, those pre-rendered graphics weren't chosen so they could look a bit strange and blocky in 30 years' time. They were chosen because they looked amazing for the tech of the day. Well, now those games genuinely can look amazing, as was always imagined. I think there are arguments for and against remaking games, and I can absolutely understand people preferring an experience that is closer to the original technology and the first conception of the title, but the original conception of the Donkey Kong Country games was way more ambitious than the technology could manage, so a graphical overhaul that tries to deliver on the promise of the 90s originals seems not just fair game, but like an idea whose time has long since come. And speaking of platformers, the Super NES plays host to 2 of the greatest ones of all time in Super Mario World and Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. I think these are much longer odds titles, especially Yoshi's Island, but what makes Super Mario World worth an outside bet is the recent release of Bowser's Fury. I do think the idea of taking a game, remaking it to be as shiny and brilliant as it can be, but then stapling on a mode that uses the same mechanics but in new and different ways is something that appeals to Nintendo. They kind of did something like this with F-Zero 99, and of course they did it with the original Super Mario Bros. When they made Super Mario Bros. 35. Do I expect a Super Mario World 40? No, but I do think there is potential at minimum for a retail version of the classic 2D Marios that really treats them with love and respect, cleaning them up, making them widescreen, adding a jukebox mode and online leaderboards and artwork and more besides. Sonic Origins isn't a perfect game by any means, but generally treated the classic Sonics pretty well, and with Mario's 40th around the corner, some kind of rejuvenation of Super Mario World seems plausible to me. Super Mario All-Stars 40th Anniversary Edition, perhaps. But of course, there are always more titles. Kirby's Dream Land 3 and Famicom Wars could always receive a touch-up, and if F-Zero can find 99 glory, then perhaps Star Fox is not quite so far behind in rocketing to a revolutionary reinvention. Star Fox 99, here we come. Scraping the bottom of the barrel, though, there is of course the iconic, beloved, and deeply problematic Mother series, and specifically the Super NES game Earthbound. If there were potential howls of rage over Super Metroid, the idea that Earthbound might be up for release while Mother 3 has yet to be issued in the West would probably make a grown wolf cry. And in some ways it would seem absolutely insane to highlight a series that Nintendo is walking on eggshells around in the West for, at minimum, some music copyright issues, but fundamentally Nintendo is a Japanese company, and with Mother being such a loved and celebrated title over there, it's not impossible to imagine that they could decide to revisit Earthbound. I do think on balance though the odds are very, very, very slim, if only because they wouldn't have released Earthbound so recently if there was any sense of a remake being in the offing. However, I have a separate video in the pipeline looking at Nintendo's long-shot titles addressing this, so I'll leave that for now. At any rate, that's a good dozen titles that, whether individually or in collected form, could be big draws on a new Nintendo system. While Super NES remakes have been dormant for a very, very long time, I think 2023 has probably started a new era for them, and I would say there is a 50% chance that before the end of 2026, there will be at least one further Super NES retail game that is either a remake or, like F-099, a remix or adapted version of a Super NES title in whole or in part. But how I missed a classic title that is just begging for reinvention. That comment section is tantalizingly close, the merest scroll away. Or why not look at the video on screen for another Nintendo forecast? Trusting that you are sufficiently tantalized with possibilities, I shall now just thank you all for watching and look forward to seeing you again for another terrific video. Thank you very much.